The words still echo in my kitchen like broken glass scattered across linoleum. David stood there, arms crossed, his work boots still caked with mud from the construction site, and looked me straight in the eye with a coldness I'd never seen before. Maybe your family's right about you, Sarah. Maybe you really are worthless. The coffee mug slipped from my hands, ceramic exploding against the floor in 1,000 pieces, just like my heart. But I didn't know then that in 3 months, those same words would taste like ash in his mouth when Mr. Harrison read my father's will. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fight started over $47. $47 that I'd spent on groceries instead of saving for David's beer fund. That's what 8 years of marriage had come to, accounting for every penny while he questioned every decision I made. The duplex on Hawthorne Boulevard felt smaller that morning, the walls pressing in as his voice rose higher. Our neighbor, Mrs. Davis, was probably listening through the thin walls again, but I'd stopped caring about appearances long ago. "Sarah, we've talked about this," David said, waving the grocery receipt like evidence in a trial. "We agreed you'd run big purchases by me first." I stared at him, exhaustion heavy in my bones. Big purchases? $47 for food was apparently a big purchase now. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was the same man who'd spent $60 the night before at Murphy's Tavern without asking anyone. I tried to keep my voice level. "David, it was groceries. We needed food." But he was already shaking his head, that familiar look of disappointment spreading across his face like a stain. It was the same look he'd perfected over the years, the one that made me feel small and stupid and grateful for whatever attention he bothered to give me. "This is exactly what your sister Jessica was talking about last week," he said, and my stomach dropped. Jessica? Of course she'd found a way into our fight from 300 miles away. "She said you've never been good with money, never been good with responsibility. Hell, Sarah, even your own mother thinks you can't handle adult decisions." The kitchen suddenly felt arctic. I gripped the counter behind me, my knuckles white against the faded laminate we'd been promising to replace for 3 years. "You talked to my family about our finances?" The question came out barely above a whisper, but it might as well have been a scream for how David reacted. "They're worried about you, Sarah, about us. Your mother called last Tuesday, crying because she's afraid you're dragging me down with you." His voice softened just enough to sound patronizing rather than cruel. "Linda said she wishes Robert was still alive to talk sense into you, but since he's not, maybe it's time someone else stepped in." My father. He'd been gone for 6 months now, and the grief still hit me like waves some days. David knew this. He knew exactly how to twist the knife. "Don't bring my father into this," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "He believed in me." David laughed, short and bitter. "Did he? Because from where I'm standing, Sarah, it looks like he left you with nothing but bills and that job at the nonprofit that barely pays rent. If he really believed in you, wouldn't he have set you up better?" The words hit their mark. I'd been wondering the same thing myself during the long, sleepless nights since the funeral. Why had Jessica inherited the house in Lake Otsego while I got nothing but condolences and a few family photos? Why had my father, who had always told me I was special, left me to struggle while my little sister lived in luxury? "At least I'm trying to help people," I said weakly. "My job matters." It was a pathetic defense, and we both knew it. David worked construction, built things people could see and touch. I coordinated programs for homeless services, filling out endless paperwork and organizing donation drives that never seemed to make a real dent in the problem. "Help people?" David's voice rose again. "Sarah, you make $28,000 a year. We can barely keep the lights on, but you want to help people? How about helping your own husband first?" He gestured around our cramped kitchen with its peeling wallpaper and dripping faucet. Look at this place. Look at our life. Your college friends are buying houses, having kids, going on vacations. What do we have? I didn't have an answer because he was right. Maya Rodriguez, my best friend from Portland State, had just bought a beautiful craftsman in Laurelhurst with her husband. They'd invited us to a housewarming party next month, and I'd already started crafting excuses for why we couldn't come. What would I say? That we couldn't afford a bottle of wine nice enough for their new kitchen? That David would spend the whole time complaining about their hardwood floors and granite countertops? I'd do my best, I said, hating how small my voice sounded. It was always the same with David. He'd start with something reasonable, a question about money, a concern about our future, and somehow twist it until I was defending my right to exist. Your best. David stepped closer and I could smell the sawdust and sweat from his work clothes. Sarah, your best got us a broken down car, a rental we can't afford, and a bank account that's empty by the 15th of every month. Your best means I work 60-hour weeks while you play social worker and feel good about yourself. I don't play anything, I shot back, finding some fire. I work just as hard as you do. At what? Shuffling papers? Organizing bake sales? His laugh was ugly now. Sarah, be honest with yourself. You're 32 years old, and what do you have to show for it? No house, no kids, no savings, no future, just a lot of good intentions and a participation trophy job. The words landed like physical blows. Every insecurity I'd ever had about my work, my life, my worth, David had just weaponized them all. I thought about Catherine Brooks, my boss, who'd praised my work just last week. I thought about the families I'd helped find housing, the kids who'd eaten because of the food programs I'd organized. But standing in that kitchen with David's disappointment radiating toward me like heat, it all felt meaningless. Maybe if you supported me instead of tearing me down every chance you get, I started, but David cut me off. Support you? Sarah, I married you when you were making even less money. I moved to this dump of a neighborhood because it's what we could afford on your nonprofit salary. I've supported you for 8 years, and what has it gotten me? A wife who can't even buy groceries without creating a financial crisis? I wanted to remind him that I'd been supporting his drinking habit, his tools that never seemed to stay organized, his mother, Patricia, who'd never worked a day in her life, but somehow always needed money for her emergencies.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But I'd learned over the years that bringing up David's flaws only made him angrier, more creative in his cruelty. I never asked you to marry me, I said quietly, and immediately regretted it. David's face went cold. No, you didn't, but you sure as hell acted grateful when I did, remember? You cried at the altar because you couldn't believe someone actually wanted you. Well, Sarah, maybe you were right to be surprised. The silence that followed was deafening. 8 years of marriage, and we'd finally arrived at the truth David had been dancing around for months. He didn't want me anymore. Maybe he never really had. I was just something that had happened to him, like a car accident or a bad investment. I think I should call my mother, I said, grasping for anything that might feel like support. Maybe she can help us figure this out. David's expression shifted to something like pity. Sarah, your mother called me yesterday. Not you, me. She wanted to apologize for how you turned out. Linda actually said she was sorry I got stuck with you. He paused, letting the words sink in. She said Jessica tried to warn me before we got married, but I didn't listen. She said the whole family knew you'd never amount to anything, but they hoped marriage might straighten you out. I felt the blood drain from my face. My own mother, my own sister. They'd been talking about me behind my back, dissecting my failures with my husband like I was a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. She wouldn't say that, I whispered. But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure. Linda Chen had always made it clear that Jessica was the daughter she'd dreamed of. beautiful, successful, married to a man with prospects. I was the consolation prize, the daughter who tried hard but never quite measured up. She did say it, Sarah. And you know what? Maybe she's right. Maybe your whole family is right. David's voice had gone quiet now, which somehow made it worse. Maybe you really are worthless. The coffee mug slipped from my hands then, the one my father had brought me from his last business trip to Seattle. It had a picture of the Space Needle on it and the words, "World's Best Daughter," in faded blue letters. As it shattered against the linoleum, I felt something shatter inside me, too. David looked down at the broken pieces, then back at me. "Clean that up," he said simply. "I'm going to Murphy's. Don't wait up." He grabbed his keys and wallet from the counter, stepped carefully around the ceramic shards, and walked out of our house like nothing had happened. I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time after his truck pulled away, listening to the drip of the faucet and the distant sound of Mrs. Davis's television through the wall. The broken mug lay scattered around my feet like tiny white teeth, and I couldn't bring myself to move. This was my life at 32, a rented duplex with peeling wallpaper, a husband who thought I was worthless, and a family who apparently agreed with him. But as I finally bent down to pick up the pieces, something strange happened. Instead of the usual shame that followed David's outbursts, I felt something else entirely. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind that burns itself out quickly, but the cold, steady kind that burns for a long time. The kind that changes things. My father Robert had always told me I was stronger than I knew. Standing there with cuts on my fingers from the broken ceramic, I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he'd been right about that too. And maybe, just maybe, there were things about my father's life that I didn't know yet. Things that would change everything. I didn't know it then, but in exactly 3 months, Mr. Thomas Harrison would call me into his office in Pioneer Courthouse Square and read me a will that would turn my entire world upside down. A will that would make David's words taste like poison in his mouth and prove that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who prepare for our success in ways we never see coming. But that morning, all I knew was that I was tired of being small, tired of apologizing for taking up space, tired of being grateful for scraps of affection from people who should have loved me unconditionally. As I swept up the pieces of my father's gift, I made a promise to myself. Whatever happened next, I would never again let anyone make me feel worthless. I had no idea that my father had already made sure of that. That was 3 months ago. 3 months since the morning David called me worthless and walked out to Murphy's Tavern while I cleaned up the pieces of my father's last gift. 3 months since I stood in that cramped kitchen on Hawthorne Boulevard, bleeding from ceramic cuts and wondering if everyone I'd ever loved was right about me. Today, Mr. Thomas Harrison sat across from me in his mahogany-paneled office overlooking Pioneer Courthouse Square, sliding a thick manila envelope across his desk with hands that trembled slightly from age. The brass nameplate read, "Harrison and Associates, Estate Planning," and the morning light streaming through tall windows made the gold lettering shimmer like something from another world. I'd never been in a lawyer's office before, never had reason to. People like me didn't have estates to plan or wills to read. We had overdue bills and secondhand furniture, and dreams we'd learned to keep quiet. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely rising above a whisper. My father didn't have money for a lawyer like you. He fixed air conditioners and heaters for a living. He drove a 15-year-old Honda and bought his clothes at Goodwill. The confusion in my chest felt physical, like trying to swallow something too large. Jessica inherited the house in Lake Oswego. She got everything. There's nothing left for lawyers and wills and meetings and fancy offices. Mr. Harrison's smile was patient, the kind reserved for people who are about to have their entire understanding of reality rearranged. He opened the manila envelope with deliberate care, extracting documents that looked official and intimidating.
In their thickness, legal seals and ribbons and signatures in blue ink that meant something important, though I couldn't begin to guess what. "Sarah, your father was my client for 23 years, he said, settling back in his chair like a man preparing to tell a long story. Robert Chen was one of the most financially astute individuals I've ever represented. He didn't just fix heating systems, he owned the company, Chen Climate Solutions, 47 employees, contracts with every major construction firm in Oregon, and a reputation for reliability that made him indispensable. The words hit me like cold water. Chen Climate Solutions. I'd heard the name before, seen their trucks around Portland with the distinctive blue and silver logo. But that was some big company, some corporate entity with office buildings and fleet vehicles. That wasn't my father, who came home with grease under his fingernails and complained about his aching back after crawling through attics all day. That's impossible, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I remembered things that suddenly made sense. The way my father always seemed to know when the heating bill was due before it arrived. How he'd paid for Jessica's college without taking loans, while I'd assumed it was because she'd earned scholarships. The business calls that would come during family dinners. Calls he'd take in another room with the seriousness I'd attributed to dedication rather than ownership. Your father lived modestly by choice, not necessity, Mr. Harrison continued, spreading the documents across his desk like a map of a foreign country. He believed that visible wealth corrupted character, particularly in children. He wanted you and Jessica to develop your own values, your own work ethic, without the cushion of family money making your decisions for you. I stared at the papers, trying to make sense of financial statements and property deeds and investment portfolios that might as well have been written in ancient Greek, numbers with more zeros than I'd ever seen outside of national debt discussions on the news. My father, Robert Chen, the man who taught me to change my own oil and comparison shop for groceries, apparently owned real estate from Portland to Eugene, held stock in companies I'd never heard of, and had been quietly building wealth for decades while wearing the same 3 work shirts in rotation. But Jessica got the house, I said weakly. She inherited everything when he died. She told the whole family at the funeral reception. She was crying about the responsibility of managing his estate. The memory felt surreal now. Jessica in her expensive black dress, dabbing her eyes with tissue while accepting condolences for the burden of inheriting property. Mark, her husband, had nodded gravely about the challenges of sudden wealth, the difficulty of managing assets they'd never expected to receive. Mr. Harrison's expression shifted to something between amusement and disgust. Jessica inherited a house worth approximately $800,000. Certainly substantial, but hardly the entirety of your father's estate. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, official and imposing, with the state seal of Oregon embossed at the top. This is your father's will, Sarah, the real one. My hands shook as I took the document, the legal language swimming before my eyes like alphabet soup. Whereas and heretofore and other words that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. But one line stood out with perfect, crystalline clarity. To my daughter, Sarah Michelle Chen Mitchell, who has spent her life serving others while asking for nothing in return, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all business assets, investment portfolios, real properties excluding the Lake Oswego residence, and liquid assets, with the total estimated value of $14.7 million. $14.7 million. The paper fluttered to my lap as my hands went numb. $14.7 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like reading about the distance to stars or the age of mountains. Real things that existed but bore no relationship to my daily reality of counting change for gas money and calculating whether we could afford both electricity and groceries in the same month. I need to clarify something important, Mr. Harrison said, his voice gentle but firm. Your father's will contained specific instructions about how this inheritance should be handled. He was very concerned about protecting you from people who might try to manipulate or take advantage of your newfound wealth. He paused, letting that sink in. Including family members and spouses. Including spouses. David's face flashed through my mind. The sneer he'd worn 3 months ago when he called me worthless. The way he'd cataloged my failures like items on a grocery list, making me feel grateful for his continued presence in my life despite my obvious inadequacies. What would that same face look like when he learned that his worthless wife was suddenly worth nearly $15 million? Your father established a trust, Mr. Harrison continued, pulling out another set of documents. For the first year following the reading of this will, you have complete control over how much information to share with anyone, including your husband. The inheritance can remain confidential while you decide how you want to proceed with your life. The weight of those words settled over me like a blanket. Complete control, confidentiality, the power to choose who knew what and when they knew it. For 8 years, David had made every major decision in our household, from where we lived to how we spent money to what dreams I was allowed to pursue. Now, I sat in a lawyer's office holding papers that gave me more financial power than David would earn in 10 lifetimes. And he was at home watching television, completely oblivious to the fact that the world had just shifted on its axis. There's something else, Mr. Harrison said, and I wasn't sure I could handle another revelation. Your father left detailed instructions about your sister Jessica. He knew she would assume she was inheriting everything, and he specifically wanted it that way. He said Jessica had always been motivated by wealth and status, and he wanted to give her enough to be comfortable, but not enough to never work again. The Lake Oswego house was intentionally positioned as the primary inheritance to maintain family harmony until you were ready to claim your actual legacy.
How long did he plan this? I asked, my voice strange and distant to my own ears. 23 years, Mr. Harrison replied. From the day you were born. He opened your trust account the week you came home from the hospital. Every business decision, every investment, every property purchase was made with your future in mind. He smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. He used to say you were the only person he'd ever met who genuinely wanted to make the world better. He said people like that deserved the resources to do it properly. 23 years. While I'd been apologizing for my existence, my father had been building me an empire. While David had been calculating the cost of my dreams, Robert Chen had been ensuring I'd never have to choose between idealism and survival again. While Jessica had been collecting family approval like trophies, my father had been quietly setting aside the tools I'd need to change everything. What happens now? I asked, though part of me was terrified of the answer. Power like this came with responsibility, and I'd spent so many years being told I was irresponsible that the weight of it felt crushing. Now you have choices, Mr. Harrison said simply. You can maintain your current life while learning to manage your inheritance gradually. You can make immediate changes. You can tell your family everything or nothing. Your father's only requirement was that you use some portion of the money to pursue work that matters to you. Would he left the definition of meaningful work entirely up to your discretion? Work that matters to me. I thought about my job at the nonprofit, helping families find housing and coordinating services for Portland's homeless population. Important work that David had dismissed as playing social worker. Work that barely paid enough to survive but felt more vital than anything else I'd ever done. What could that work become with unlimited resources behind it? What problems could be solved? What lives could be changed? What systems could be built if money was never again an obstacle? But first, I had to decide what to do about David, about Jessica, about a family that had spent years making me feel small while my father had been quietly ensuring I'd have the power to be enormous. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. The people who'd called me worthless would soon discover that I was worth more than they'd ever dreamed of being. Your father included a personal letter, Mr. Harrison said, handing me an envelope with my name written in Robert Chen's careful handwriting. He asked me to give this to you after we'd discussed the practical details. I took the letter with trembling fingers, afraid to open it and afraid not to. Everything I thought I'd known about my life had been wrong. Everything I'd believed about my father, my worth, my future, it had all been based on carefully constructed fiction designed to protect me until I was strong enough to handle the truth. The envelope was sealed with red wax, old-fashioned and formal. Inside, 3 pages covered in my father's neat script, the same handwriting that had signed permission slips and birthday cards, and the occasional encouraging note left on my bathroom mirror during high school. But these words carried weight I'd never felt before. Authority I'd never associated with the man who'd taught me to ride a bicycle and helped with algebra homework. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have discovered that your old father was full of surprises. I hope you can forgive an old man his deceptions, but I needed you to become yourself before you became wealthy. Money changes people, darling girl, and I wanted to make sure it would change you in the right direction." I could hear his voice in every word, gentle and wise and tinged with the slight accent he'd never quite lost from his childhood in Taiwan. The letter went on to explain his philosophy, his fears about raising children with too much privilege, his observation that Jessica had always been motivated by external validation, while I'd been driven by internal conviction. "You have spent your life proving that you don't need money to be generous, don't need status to be valuable, don't need anyone's permission to care deeply about making the world better. Now you have the resources to match your convictions, and I cannot wait to see what you build with them." The letter ended with a warning that felt prophetic in light of everything that had happened with David. "Be careful who you trust with this information, my darling. People who never saw your worth when you had nothing may suddenly discover your value when you have everything. True love doesn't change based on bank statements. True love sees your worth regardless of your wealth. True love sees your worth regardless of your wealth." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, my mind spinning with possibilities and implications and the sheer overwhelming magnitude of choices I'd never imagined having to make. Mr. Harrison watched me process everything with the patience of someone accustomed to life-changing revelations. Finally, he spoke. "Sarah, you don't have to decide everything today. The money isn't going anywhere. Your father's trust is ironclad, professionally managed, and growing steadily. Take time to absorb this. Talk to people you trust, really trust, and remember that your father chose you for this responsibility because he believed in your judgment." I stood on shaking legs, the documents clutched against my chest like armor. Outside the tall windows, Portland continued its daily routine. People walking to coffee shops and jobs and ordinary lives, where the most stressful decision was whether to splurge on organic vegetables. None of them knew that Sarah Mitchell, the woman in the thrift store blazer who'd walked into this building an hour ago, was walking out as one of the wealthiest individuals in Oregon. The elevator ride down felt like descending from a mountaintop back to sea level, each floor marking a return to reality that would never quite be the same. In the lobby, I caught my sight of reflection in the polished marble walls, same mousy brown hair, same uncertain posture, same face that had never learned to expect good news. But something in my eyes had changed, some fundamental shift in the way I held my shoulders. For the first time in months, I didn't look apologetic for taking up space. On the street, Portland's October rain had started, that fine mist that soaked through everything without seeming substantial enough to matter. I stood under the building's awning, watching people hurry past with their umbrellas and newspapers, and realized I was at the most important crossroads of my life. Every relationship, every assumption, every plan I'd made based on being powerless, it all had to be reconsidered now. David would be home from work soon, probably already planning another lecture about my financial irresponsibility or my
Worthless career. He'd be expecting me to apologize for existing, to be grateful for his tolerance of my inadequacies. Instead, I'd be sitting on information that would turn our entire marriage inside out. Information that proved everything he'd said about my worth had been catastrophically wrong. But I wasn't ready to share that information yet. Not with David, not with Jessica, not with anyone who'd spent years making me feel small.
My father had given me the gift of choice, the power to decide when and how to reveal this truth. For the first time in my adult life, I held all the cards. As I walked to my battered Honda Civic, the one David complained about weekly, I made my first decision as a secret millionaire. I was going to take my time. I was going to watch and listen and learn who people really were when they thought I still had nothing to offer them. I was going to discover what David's love was really worth when he still believed I was worthless. And then, when I was ready, I was going to show them all exactly how wrong they'd been about Sarah Chen Mitchell. The rain picked up as I drove home to the duplex on Hawthorne Boulevard, but for the first time in months, I didn't mind getting wet. After all, what was a little water when you were worth $14.7 million and nobody knew it but you? David's truck was already in the driveway when I pulled up, and I could see the blue glow of the television through our thin curtains. He'd be sprawled in his recliner, probably drinking his third beer of the evening and ready to catalog whatever I'd done wrong that day. 3 months ago, the sight would have filled me with dread. Tonight, it filled me with something much more dangerous: curiosity. I wanted to see what worthless looked like to a man who was about to discover he'd married one of the wealthiest women in the state. Growing up, I was the daughter who asked too many questions and cared too much about things that didn't matter to anyone else. While Jessica spent Saturday mornings at dance lessons and piano recitals, carefully cultivating the accomplishments that would earn her gold stars and family praise, I was usually found in our backyard in Lake Oswego, building elaborate houses for beetles or organizing rescue missions for injured birds I'd find beneath our oak trees. My mother, Linda, would watch me through the kitchen window, shaking her head with the particular brand of exasperation reserved for children who refuse to conform to reasonable expectations. "Sarah, honey, come inside and practice your handwriting," she'd call, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone trying to redirect a wayward ship. "Jessica is working on her multiplication tables. Don't you want to keep up with your sister?" But I never wanted to keep up with Jessica. I wanted to understand why ants marched in perfect lines and whether earthworms felt pain when robins pulled them from the soil. I wanted to know why some flowers opened toward the sun while others bloomed only at night, and whether the stray cat that visited our garbage cans had a family somewhere missing him. These were the mysteries that kept me awake at night, staring at my ceiling and wondering about worlds within worlds that adults seemed too busy to notice. My father, Robert, understood this about me in ways that my mother never could. While Linda fretted about my grass-stained clothes and dirty fingernails, Robert would find me crouched behind the garden shed, documenting the daily activities of a spider I'd named Charlotte. And instead of scolding me for ruining another outfit, he'd ask what I'd discovered that day. "Tell me about Charlotte's web," he'd say, settling beside me on the damp earth despite wearing his good work pants. "What makes her different from the spider by the front door?" And I'd launch into detailed explanations about web patterns and hunting strategies, about how Charlotte seemed more cautious than her counterparts, how she'd rebuilt her web 3 times after storms while other spiders had simply found new locations. Robert never acted like my observations were silly or worthless. He listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for important adult conversations, asking follow-up questions that made me think deeper about what I'd seen. "That's fascinating, sweetheart," he'd say, his voice serious and thoughtful. "You notice things other people miss. That's a special gift." Linda would call us in for dinner eventually, her voice sharp with the frustration of managing a household where her younger daughter preferred insects to inside activities. "Robert, stop encouraging her," she'd whisper when she thought I couldn't hear. "She needs to learn to act like a normal little girl. Jessica doesn't come home looking like she's been rolling in mud." But Jessica and I were different species entirely, something that became more obvious as we grew older. She thrived on structure and recognition, collecting achievements like beautiful stones to display on her bedroom shelf, perfect attendance awards, honor roll certificates, first-place ribbons from piano competitions. Jessica's room was a shrine to conventional success, each trophy representing another step closer to the kind of life our mother had always envisioned for both her daughters. My room, by contrast, was a museum of things other people considered junk. Feathers I'd found during walks through Forest Park, smooth rocks collected from the Willamette River, pressed flowers between the pages of books I'd borrowed from the library about wildlife rehabilitation and environmental science.
Where Jessica's space spoke of accomplishment, mine whispered of curiosity and wonder about the natural world that existed just beyond our manicured suburban boundaries. The first real crack in our family's expectations came when I was 12 and Jessica was 9. Our school had organized a science fair, and while Jessica dutifully created a volcano that erupted with baking soda and vinegar, exactly the kind of project that impressed teachers and parents with its neat, predictable results, I spent 3 months documenting the rehabilitation of an injured crow I'd found in our neighborhood. I'd convinced Mrs. Eleanor Davis, our neighbor who'd worked as a veterinary technician before retiring, to help me nurse the bird to health.
Arrange her volcano display with picture-perfect precision while I sat at the kitchen table writing note cards to accompany my crow rehabilitation journal. Sarah's project is so messy, I heard my mother whisper to my father as they thought I was absorbed in my work. How was she supposed to compete with real science projects? Jessica's volcano demonstrates actual chemical reactions. But Robert had been following my crow project with genuine interest. He'd helped me construct a simple chart showing the bird's progress, and he'd even driven me to the library several times to research crow intelligence and rehabilitation techniques. Sarah's project demonstrates real scientific observation, he told my mother, his voice quiet but firm. She's documented a complete process from injury through recovery. That's exactly what real scientists do. The morning of the science fair, I stood beside my display table feeling small and uncertain, while Jessica commanded attention 3 tables away with her perfectly erupting volcano and memorized presentation about chemical reactions. Parents and teachers clustered around her display, nodding appreciatively at her clear explanations and neat visual aids. My table felt like an island of weirdness in a sea of conventional projects. My rehabilitation journal looked homemade and amateur compared to the printed posters and purchased materials surrounding me. The photographs of my crow were fuzzy and informal, nothing like the crisp diagrams and charts that decorated other displays. But then Dr. Martinez, the wildlife biologist who'd been invited to judge the fair, stopped at my table. She was a small woman with kind eyes and hands that moved expressively when she talked, and she spent 20 minutes asking me detailed questions about my observations and methods. She wanted to know how I'd tracked the crow's progress, what resources I'd used to learn about rehabilitation techniques, how I'd documented behavioral changes as the bird healed. "This is remarkable work for someone your age," Dr. Martinez told me, holding my journal carefully as she examined my charts and drawings. "You've documented a complete rehabilitation process with the kind of detailed observation that professional wildlife rehabilitators use. Have you considered that this might be something you'd want to study more seriously?" I won first place in the environmental science category that day, but more importantly, I discovered that my weird interests and unconventional observations weren't character flaws to be corrected. They were the foundation of something that could matter in the world beyond our suburban neighborhood. Linda accepted my blue ribbon with polite pride, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. She'd expected Jessica's volcano to win recognition, not my messy documentation of bird rehabilitation. "It's wonderful, honey," she said, but her voice carried the bewilderment of someone trying to be supportive while fundamentally not understanding what she was supporting. Robert, however, was quietly jubilant. That evening, after Jessica had gone to bed, still sulking about her honorable mention ribbon, he sat with me on our back porch and asked me to tell him everything Dr. Martinez had said about my project. "She thinks you have real talent for this kind of work," he told me, his voice warm with pride I'd never heard before. "She said you observe things like a natural scientist." "But Mom thinks it's weird," I said, voicing the fear that had been growing in my chest all day. "She wants me to be more like Jessica." Robert was quiet for a long moment, looking out at our backyard where Charlotte's Web caught the last rays of evening sunlight. Finally, he spoke. "Sarah, your mother loves you very much, but she doesn't understand that there are many different ways to be successful in this world. She thinks success looks like Jessica because that's the only kind of success she's ever seen. But you're going to show her that there are other ways to make a difference,
ways that use the gifts you were born with instead of trying to pretend you're someone else. That conversation marked the beginning of what I now realize was my father's long-term investment in my unconventional dreams. While Linda continued to worry about my dirty fingernails and grass-stained clothes, Robert quietly supported my growing interest in wildlife and environmental science. He bought me field guides and nature journals, drove me to wildlife refuges and nature centers, introduced me to people who worked in conservation and rehabilitation. When I was 14 and announced that I wanted to volunteer at the Oregon Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Linda's immediate response was concern about disease and injury and the inappropriateness of a young girl working with wild animals. But Robert had already researched the program, spoken with the director about safety protocols, and arranged to drive me to weekend volunteer sessions. "She needs to follow her interests," he told Linda when she protested about the time commitment and potential dangers. "This isn't a phase. This is who she is." And he was right. Working with injured wildlife felt like coming home, in a way that nothing else had ever had. I learned to prepare specialized diets for orphaned raccoons, assist with medical treatments for injured raptors, maintain detailed records of animal behavior and recovery progress. The work was often messy and heartbreaking and physically demanding, but it felt essential in ways I couldn't articulate to anyone who hadn't experienced the profound satisfaction of watching a rehabilitated animal return to the wild. Jessica, meanwhile, continued to excel in conventional ways that made our mother glow with pride. Honor Society, student government, debate team, early acceptance to Portland State University, with plans to study business administration. She was becoming exactly the kind of daughter Linda had always dreamed of: polished, ambitious, focused on achievements that translated clearly into future success. But Robert saw something different in my unconventional path. While Linda worried that I was limiting my options by focusing so intensely on wildlife work, Robert understood that I was developing expertise in something that mattered deeply to me. "Not everyone has to want the same things," he would tell Linda when she fretted about my future prospects. "Sarah has found work that feeds her soul. That's rarer and more valuable than you realize." By the time I graduated from high school, I knew exactly what I wanted to study in college and exactly what kind of work I wanted to do afterward. While Jessica planned a business degree that would lead to corporate success and financial security, I dreamed of environmental science and wildlife rehabilitation, of spending my life helping creatures that couldn't help themselves. The tension this created in our family was subtle but persistent. Linda wanted both her daughters to pursue conventional paths toward success, paths that would lead to respectability and financial stability, while I seemed determined to choose work that was emotionally rewarding but economically uncertain. She never said directly that she disapproved of my choices, but her constant suggestions about practical alternatives and backup plans made her feelings clear. Robert, however, continued to encourage my unconventional dreams with an enthusiasm that I now understand was born from his secret knowledge about my future financial security. He knew I'd never have to choose between following my passion and paying my bills. But he couldn't tell me that without risking the very character development he was trying to protect. Looking back now, I can see how carefully he walked that line, supporting my dreams without revealing the safety net he'd already constructed, encouraging my independence while secretly ensuring I'd have the resources to pursue any path I chose. He was raising me to value meaningful work over financial gain, all while knowing that someday I'd have both. But at 17, applying to colleges with acceptance letters for environmental science programs that excited me and terrified my mother in equal measure, I had no idea that my father was already planning to make sure my idealistic dreams would never be crushed by economic reality. I thought I was choosing a difficult path that would require sacrifice and compromise. I had no idea I was choosing a path my father had been secretly preparing me to walk with unlimited resources and unshakable confidence, the foundation for everything that happened later,
David's dismissal of my career, my family's assumption that I'd chosen unwisely, my own moments of doubt about whether following my heart had been worth the financial struggle, all of it was built on the carefully constructed illusion that I was pursuing meaningful work at the expense of practical success. My father let me believe that illusion because he wanted me to prove to myself that my values weren't dependent on financial security. He wanted me to discover that I could find purpose and joy in difficult work, even when that work was undervalued by the people around me. And I had proven that, hadn't I? I'd spent years coordinating homeless services and wildlife rehabilitation programs, finding satisfaction in work that mattered, even when it barely paid enough to survive. I'd chosen love over money when I married David, and I'd chosen service over salary every time I'd been offered easier, better-paying jobs that would have taken me away from the populations I wanted to help. Now, sitting in my Honda Civic outside the duplex on Hawthorne Boulevard with Mr. Harrison's papers hidden in my purse, I finally understood the true genius of my father's plan. He hadn't just left me money, he'd left me the knowledge that I could be happy without it. He'd given me something far more valuable than wealth. He'd given me the unshakable certainty that my worth wasn't measured by my bank account. And tomorrow, when David came home expecting to find the same powerless, financially dependent wife he'd been diminishing for years, he was going to discover just how wrong he'd been about everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.